Ahoy, everyone. This is David Eugene Perry with our continuing series of interviews with clients, colleagues, friends, people around the world, and how they got from the great pause of 2020 into the hoped for great recovery of 2021. And I'm delighted to be in the Zoom room with someone who shares, well, a passion that I have, of course, world travel. But although I've been to several continents, I haven't been to the one that we're going to speak to our next guest about, Antarctica. Welcome to the Zoom room, Mark Vogler. Mark, how are you?
I'm good, David. How are you doing?
I'm very fine. So I was speaking with our mutual friend and colleague, David Kleiman, the other day, and he said, well, David, I know you like to travel and you've collected some interesting stories about people and where they went during COVID, but Mark Vogler has the most unique one. Tell us a little bit about how you faced 2020 and where you faced it.
Okay, well, 2020 was a challenging. First of all, I work in Antarctica. So I'm an expedition guide. And we left at the very beginning of January to circumnavigate the continent, to sail all the way to New Zealand, back, turn over the crew in New Zealand or guests. And it's a 32-day sail each way. So we go down Argentina, cross the Drake Passage, around the continent, all the way around the continent, past and into the Ross Ice, the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, stop at McMurdo Station, up to the subantarctic islands, and then New Zealand subantarctic islands. Well, there were weeks at a time where we didn't have internet access. So we really had no concept of what was happening back in the real world, because it does feel like an alternate planet when you go to Antarctica. It's completely isolated, it's hard to get to, and sometimes you don't have communication. So coming back, we'd started to catch wind of it. A couple Chinese passengers were not allowed to board, or New Zealand didn't let them in. And at that point, this is now mid-February. And, we think, okay, maybe it's like SARS. It's not a big deal. Okay, New Zealand, we know they're super tight on their immigration and things like that anyway. Not a big deal. We'll just keep on our path. And we did. And we went back to the Ross Sea and the ice shelf and Scott's Hut. Legendary Robert Falcon Scott's Hut is still standing and it's pristine. Sailed around the continent, and we start approaching Argentina, and we start getting word about really starting to understand what's happening with COVID.
And what date was that around?
That was around when we started really understanding it. This was going to be around March 10th, maybe.
Which is just when things, of course, here in the continental United States were really beginning to get real.
They were. And so, but, my company, the company I work for, is from the Netherlands. So we're also getting a lot of information about what's happening in Europe with the lockdowns, what's happening in Italy, where you guys were. But again, we still really didn't understand it because we had free run of the ship. We had no social distancing, all the food we could eat. It was just business as usual until we get to our port in Ushuaia, Argentina, which is at the very, very end of South America, up the Beagle Channel, and they wouldn't let us port. They wouldn't let us dock. And we said, wait a second, what is happening here? And they said, sorry, you can't dock here. There's an epidemic happening, a pandemic, and we're afraid you people have it on the ships.
And how many passengers were you on board at that time?
We had just about 100 passengers, guests, and about 58, 60 crew. So around 150 people total on the ship. And, it was the end of our season. That was it. So we were going to get off the ship and go home. Well, we start really getting a better understanding of what's happening, but they say, sorry, we've closed our borders. If you make a run for Buenos Aires, you may be able to get there before they close the borders, the port there. So we do. But that's a 5-day sail. It's not like you get on a plane and you go. By the time we get there, they wouldn't let us dock. And so we still had all the passengers. They've missed all their flights. I missed my flight home. We're still now trying to figure out what can we do? How can we get passengers off?
And what was the state of mind? I mean, having worked aboard ship for over 2 years, went around the world, crew is one thing, but guests as a whole special hand-holding. What was their emotional response?
Indeed, it was a hand-holding. Most were pretty good. I think this is a little different than, when you go on expedition, you understand that there's going to be some unforeseen circumstances. This was extreme. So while there was about half the guests who were kind of excited about the possibility of staying on the ship to either till we found a port or sail all the way across the Atlantic to the Netherlands. And so, I mean, who gets an opportunity to do that? So the other people, of course, were a little bit freaking out because they had family back home, work to get back to, worrying about catching COVID because we'd been in an isolated bubble since January, right? And so we just really, the emotions were all over the board. And then, of course, the challenges are when you're on a paid expedition, guests are saying, well, it's not my fault we missed the ship or the flight home. You wouldn't let us dock, or they wouldn't let us dock. Or at one point, we couldn't actually, on the return trip, we couldn't land at McMurdo. They closed the base. And we had some guests there who were saying, we paid specifically to go here. So what are you going to do? And some got really nasty at me. I'm out on the bow. I worked at McMurdo. So I'm out on the bow as we're sailing by, and we went around to Scott Base. So we got as close as we could, pointing out buildings and where things are. And Scott's hut, the Discovery hut is there, his other hut is there. And somebody got really nasty with me. And I finally had to say, if you want to take it up with the US government, please do, you can. This is their base. And that kind of shut them up. But I feel for them. I really do. But at the same time, we're experiencing a global pandemic, but we still really didn't have much understanding of the depth and breadth of it.
Because where were you mainly getting your news? Just from the internet?
No, it was coming across from the company to the ship, to the captain. But it's, not everything necessarily was trickling down right away, but we also really still didn't understand it. It was blowing up so fast. And then we went dark. We had 5 days with absolutely no communications at all, as we're around the west side of Antarctica, midway between New Zealand and Argentina. And, it's people are stressed, and that makes, when there's variations in the itinerary, they get more stressed. And it's, look, it's a long, expensive trip. It is. But when you're going to a place like Antarctica, the weather rules. So when you have changes, like on the way back, it's late in the season. The weather was not great, and it was freezing. Literally, the ocean was freezing around us. Literally. And we're trying to get out. We're having to go slow. Ice is sticking to us. And people are getting upset about, well, we may or may not be able to do a helicopter trip onto the ice shelf. I get it. But if we don't get out of here, we're not getting out of here.
Right.
And so, but I understand it. But when we got to Buenos Aires, now they don't let us off. Passengers starting to freak out. But there was a constant, after we left Ushuaia in that 5-day period, people are scrambling to try and find new flights, right? How are they going to get a flight? What's it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? All of those things. And we get to Buenos Aires, they don't let us in. So now we're heading to Montevideo in Ushuaia, in Uruguay. So all of the flights have to be changed again. And people are kind of getting a little tense at this point. And I finally gave up, thinking, we'll see what the company says. They can handle it for me. But I didn't get a flight out. So what's the worst that can happen to me? I get to stay on ship. But so I ended up doing that. We get to Montevideo. They had us sit there for several days at the pier, but we couldn't unload. I think it was actually almost 5 days.
So there was no one allowed off the ship or on. And you, at this point, were you bringing new food on, new fuel? Were you?
That's a good question. Okay, I'll have to back up a little bit. When we got to Ushuaia, they did let us tie up at the pier. They wouldn't let us get off the ship, wouldn't let passengers off, nobody on the ship. They did actually crane provisions onto the deck for us. So then we have to move everything down deck. And they did bring a ship up to refuel us. So we did that. We had enough fuel and food, if we had to, for everybody to get back to the Netherlands. So I have to say the company, Oceanwide, was great about bearing that expense. Like, we don't know if we can let people off, and it was a scramble. Where do we go? Do we go to the Falklands? Some ships, there were 10 ships heading for the Falklands at Port Stanley all at once.
And I imagine ships of varying sizes, not just small expedition ships like yours.
Absolutely. There were actually larger expedition ships. I don't know if there were any merchant marine ships, but there were larger expedition ships like the Greg Mortimer, which ended up being a little famous because they did have an outbreak. And they're about 200 people, I think. And, you know, it got to a point, the Falklands like, we're closed. We're not letting any more ships come into our waters because we can't support them. You know, the frustrating part, I think, mostly for the passengers and crew alike, is we were in a completely sterile environment. So for me, looking at what was happening, I think the US had hit 1 million at that point cases by the time we got to Montevideo. And I'm looking at it thinking, you know what, I'm going to go to New Zealand. I was supposed to be in New Zealand anyway. I have friends and family there. I'll just go there. I couldn't get in. My bestie, another guide who actually was our New Zealand observer from the New Zealand Department of Conservation. When you go into the New Zealand waters and the Scott base and all of those, you have to have someone observe your operations to make sure you're following regulations in terms of landings. We became great friends, and he got to go home. I said, well, Phil, I'm going to go with you. And they would let him because he's a New Zealand citizen, but they wouldn't allow me to do so. And, you know, my argument is, look, we've been in the same argument or the same environment. The virus doesn't know if I'm a Kiwi or an American or an Argentinian or a penguin. It really doesn't. And they said, too bad. So I ended up on the ship. We finally, after 5 days, the Chileans, the company worked in agreement with the Chileans to set up a sterile corridor, they called it, where passengers would get notified sort of last minute. They had to be ready and wait for hours or days. When is that going to happen? Buses came. They had to put on masks and gloves, sterilize the bags, get on the bus, closed buses. They were escorted with police directly to the airport and put on planes out of the country. And that's how we managed to do it. And half the crew got to go. They managed to get tickets. So that was a huge relief because we were very worried, certainly, about passengers. We knew we didn't have to worry about an outbreak, but we also, you know, the question is always there. Well, what if provisions did come on when they came on? What if they were infected? What, you know, and so we were very fortunate, but we really didn't understand what was happening.
And at this point, how much extra had your trip become? At what are you now 2 weeks over what the voyage was supposed to be? 3 weeks?
We're about, by the time we hit Montevideo, at least at this point, we are about 2 weeks over, 10 days probably, from going from our port in Ushuaia to Montevideo. And then we don't know how long it is, right? So we get passengers off and we just start sailing north to see if we can find another port to let the crew off. What can we do? And finally, the company just decided we're going to take the last 50 people, sort of a skeleton crew, all the way to the Netherlands. And you can go from there.
And so how long, and that's usually, I mean,
that was
I'm not sure how long I'm not sure how fast your ship went, but I imagine it's what, six day crossing?
Oh, no, it's a month. We travel at about 10 knots.
Okay.
This is not a big ship with a lot. I mean, it's powerful, but you know, if we're really pushing it, we're going maybe 14 knots, you know, but no, it's a month crossing. And what an experience, you know, nervousness, like what are we in for? What are we in for when we get back? Because we're still a bubble. You know, I still had some work to do and found things to keep me busy, like managing inventory and looking over all of that stuff. There was only a couple of us guides left and a skeleton crew and the bridge crew. So we're all good friends anyway. So we got to hang out and watch movies together in the bar and drink and just not have to worry about it. But I think all of us had some trepidation around what we were sailing back to. Mm-hmm. Was it going to be like an alternate planet Earth? It really felt like that. Like we'd gone across the Drake Passage in this crazy world, spent 2.5 months in Antarctica, and what kind of a planet are we coming back to? It really felt like that. And at first it was great. The amount of wildlife in the South Atlantic off the coast of South America, off the coast of Brazil, mind-boggling. Just pods of sperm whales breaching and hanging out, tons of different species of dolphins. But I think one of the most surprising things is we're out leaving Montevideo, maybe a day or two out, and we suddenly see little lights on the horizon. And they start popping up, and as far as you can see, hundreds of them. And it felt very much like the little lights in Close Encounters.
Yes.
Right? The little things flying around, and they're there because it's dark. So when it's night, you don't really have a difference between sky and ocean when you don't have a moon.
Right.
And we see these on the horizon, and it turns out that it's an illegal Chinese squid fleet. And there are hundreds of them lighting up the horizon, and they're squid fishing right between this narrow gap between the Argentinian waters and Brazilian waters and the Falklands. So they're a pirate crew, but nobody can really do anything to them. And it was kind of surreal actually to see that. And that went on for a couple of days. It was so big. And it's distressing actually to see this kind of sort of ravaging of the resources.
Yeah, and environmental terrorism.
Absolutely it is, for sure. And amazing to see, troubling as well.
So in the month that you took to cross,
yeah,
I mean, having worked aboard ship, I know what it's like when they say aboard ship, "Oh, we have internet access." I'm like, yeah, okay, take that to the bank. At what point did you start getting a consistent flow of information that made you think this is what it's going to be like when I step off? And where were you going to dock? Amsterdam or
actually just south in Vlissingen?
Yeah.
And so, the problem was in those early days, not being there, the information was changing so fast around what borders were open, what were closed, the death rates we're seeing in Italy, in Genoa, right? What is the UK doing? America's starting to blow up. And so there was so much information coming at us. We had a good connection pretty much most of the crossing. Mid-Atlantic, we didn't have a great one. Like you said, yeah, sure, we have internet access. Not really. Maybe a trickle. It might take, I had times when it would take 10 minutes to post like a very low res picture. You just put it on and let it go and walk away and come back. Yeah. It actually ended up causing a breakup in a new relationship I had, which sucks because when I was in Antarctica and that crossing, this person didn't believe he could see that I'd post because I'm a little tech nerd. So I tied everything to Instagram to then post it out to everything else. And it was like, well, you're posting. Why aren't you responding to my stuff? I'm like, I never got anything from you. I'm in Antarctica, So, but we didn't have consistent information again. Borders were opening or closing, and more people were dying, and we really didn't even know all the way across until we got to the Netherlands if they were going to let us disembark The Last of Us. They didn't even know, I don't think. And so it was scary. It was just, for me, it was difficult. What I've been doing between Antarctic and the Arctic is I've been learning German in Munich for work, because there's a lot of Germans who travel in the polar regions, and German companies will charter the whole ship. Right? German tourist companies. So I already have a background in German. I speak a little German. It's been like 30 years. So I've been studying, but I got there in anticipation to go back to Munich, and the EU said, sorry, you're getting on a plane and you're going back to America. And so for me, it completely disrupted my plan. I know we all have had that. It might be good, might be bad. I rationalized, like, look, my mom's alone. She's almost 80. She's not in great health. I should at least go check on her. Fine. I'll go home and then I'll come back. The EU closed at the beginning of July.
So what was the total time from the moment you heard the word COVID till you stepped off the ship in Holland?
Well, it was April 29th when we stepped off the ship.
So that's if I did the math, that's 2.5 months.
At least. Yeah. So we probably first heard COVID sometime, a little bit, start seeing news things about, there's the little outbreak in China in mid-February. early mid-February, and we didn't really pay any attention to it. And then we'd see a little bit, but then we got a little more info, but not anything that really concerned us again, because we thought it was strictly limited to Wuhan. Like I said earlier, the New Zealand government would let a couple Chinese passengers who were coming on to do the circumnavigation back. Okay, well, sorry. Okay. But we didn't get it really till, again, we got to Argentina. Or close to. Really, it was the company started sending messages through the captain when we're leaving, really starting to leave the peninsula, the Antarctic Peninsula. And we had to sort of go, just sail to Ushuaia, do not pass go, do not collect $200, because we were worried about not getting there.
Right. Having worked aboard a ship whose top speed was 20 knots.
Oh my God.
I can imagine that's awesome. Pushing 14, that must have been leisurely, but also to your point, the opportunity to see some of the wildlife, you don't see traveling at higher speeds. And in our last few moments, talk to me about something that I've asked everyone who's been on the show for the last 9 months. How has the experience of COVID affected you? What do you think you're going to be different like now, a year on? How has it changed how you look at your job and your life?
It's actually really, there's a lot of concern with all of us guides, myself included, because we don't know when we're going back to work like everybody. I think, how has it changed me? I think it's been incredibly difficult. Do I appreciate things more? I don't know. I pretty much appreciated Antarctica and my job anyway. I feel sorry for the people, and I feel sorry for some of the Filipino sailors some were on board for months. And
there are still crewmen in this world who aren't repatriated.
There are, yes, because the Philippines is closed, and I feel bad for them. And it's difficult because a lot of us, I do have colleagues now who are deciding to leave the industry a year on because they can't not work anymore. And this is their passion. This is what we do. I mean, I gave up a completely different career and changed my life 380 degrees to do this work that I've fallen in love with. None of us know when it's going to start again because, okay, we may get some herd immunity, but are countries like Argentina going to allow ships to dock? There was one yesterday that was running low on fuel that New Zealand wouldn't let them provision. When this is going to go to work, and I'm just hoping, praying that we'll be able to, and people will be able to get back on ship, and people will feel safe on ship, and crew will be safe. At the beginning, crew wasn't really worried about it. We didn't think about it. But now, if they said, go to work back tomorrow to the Arctic or Antarctica, I'm not sure what I would do, because we have hundreds of people come through that ship during a season. And what would I do without being vaccinated?
Correct.
Or even with the vaccine? I don't know. So it's changed me in a way that it makes me sort of appreciate slowing down a little bit. But it also is incredibly frustrating because I'm missing my muse. Right. All of us who work there are missing Antarctica very much.
Well, Mark, I appreciate you speaking with us as someone who worked aboard ship. I've always wanted to go to Antarctica. Hearing you talk about it makes me want to go even more. And I was just reading today one of the maritime blogs about, when people think we'll be on board ship. And to your point, when crew will feel comfortable and safe, because that's where it all starts with. So when we get to that point, when you hopefully will be back aboard ship or back on Antarctica, I want to have you on the show again. Any closing thoughts for our viewers?
Stay safe and plan your Antarctica trip now, because it will reopen. And there's so many ships that were in the pipeline that there's going to be some great deals.
Great. Well, we'll all be back aboard ship soon. I've been speaking with explorer, fellow seaman, Mark Vogler. From David Perry, this is saying ahoy. Thank you.